a bell that tolled at midnight, and a secret that refused to stay buried. Welcome to Marple Manor. I am your host, Hartwell. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your comments always bring this mystery to life. Let's begin. Snow had fallen fitfully all afternoon over St. Mary Mead, as if the heavens were practicing rather than performing. By evening it lay in fine siftings upon hedgerows and slate roofs, and dusted the square tower of St. Mildred's as delicately as icing sugar upon a cake. The village, in consequence, presented its best face for the midnight carol service, windows breathing warm light, holly wreaths with berries like drops of sealing wax, the faint creak of boots on crisp paths, the rustle of hymn sheets. Inside the church, fir boughs lent their resinous scent to the air, and a cradle of candles made the stone appear softer than it was. Miss Jane Marple, who did not care for draughts and had a notable memory for their habits, had chosen a seat 3 rows from the back and to the left, where the pillar could be relied upon to break the worst of the wind when the door opened. She had taken off one glove and kept the other, the better to turn pages without numbing her fingers. Beside her, Mrs. Hartnell whispered industriously about influenza and the price of coal, which did not require answers, only the small encouraging noises Miss Marple gave so well. At the front, the choir shuffled in their surplices, and the organ exhorted them to be cheerful. The village had turned out in full. Mrs. Emmeline Dodd, the vicar's wife and a busy woman of charitable interruptions, Mr. Lionel Braithwaite, newly arrived and full of opinions, who had contributed a handsome sum for the refurbishment of the bell frame and took the manner of a man presenting a gift to posterity. Mr. Ezra Pottle, the verger, whose beard possessed a sanctity independent of its owner, young Tom Reeves from the Blue Boar with a carnation in his buttonhole and a new ambition to be considered respectable, and Mrs. Lucy Ames, the postmistress, never far from a parcel and a piece of news. Also conspicuous was a woman in a sable collar, Mrs. Clarissa Fane, whose bracelet clicked when she moved, and whose gaze said she was observing the village with the coolness of a stranger who meant to be amused. "Oh, come, all ye faithful," announced the vicar. And the faithful, more or fewer, came to it with the enthusiasm of those who knew their parts. Mr. Braithwaite sang loudly, as men will when they suspect the occasion is partly theirs. He was to make a small speech before the final hymn, something about tradition and community and the proper maintenance of English bells. He was a square man with a neat moustache and the healthy complexion of someone who never considered his digestion until it improved. Miss Marple watched him with mild attention. She noted that he turned slightly to his right when the woman with the sable collar coughed, an odd, contained little cough, and that he did not glance back when the church door opened, letting in a curl of cold air and the bell ringer, Ned Pollock stamping snow from his boots. Ned, dark-haired with a stubborn tilt to his jaw, had rung the bells at St. Mildred's since he was a boy, and if he sometimes drank more at the Blue Boar than his mother would wish, he rang with a precision that could be heard and respected in the next parish. At the end of the second carol, the vicar gave his little homily, comfort, joy, charity toward our neighbours, and then, with solemn pleasure, he announced that at midnight precisely, the bell would sound its special peal to mark both the nativity and the village's gratitude for Mr. Braithwaite's generosity. This caused a polite murmur and a dozen glances toward Mr. Braithwaite, who inclined his head modestly and examined his cufflink. "Poor man," Mrs. Hartnell muttered. "It's all very well buying bells and such, but people will expect something of him now. Once you begin improving things, it's difficult to stop. I told George as much when he got the new hen-house." Miss Marple smiled into her hymn book. She was not a woman to despise improvements, but she understood the perils of beginning anything, particularly when it touched upon habit, pride, and noise. The minutes crept toward midnight. The breath of the congregation rose in faint fogs when the door opened and a few latecomers slid in. The church smelt wonderfully of beeswax and damp wool. Somewhere behind Miss Marple, a child fell briefly asleep with the melodious sigh of the very young. The verger discreetly shifted a poinsettia that looked as if it wanted to dominate the nativity scene. Miss Marple admired the tiny crocheted star draped upon the manger. Nice work. Fine even tension. And thought fleetingly of the small ball of blue wool she had in her pocket, kept there against the possibility of a dropped stitch in life or knitting. When the vicar finally closed his prayer book, a ripple of expectation ran through the pews. The old clock in the tower began its grave count of the hour, and after the 12th stroke, there followed the poised silence that belongs only to midnight on Christmas Eve. Then the bell spoke. It should have been the familiar voice of St. Mildred's, round and assured, with a homely dignity, but what sounded was urgent, uneven and rather wild, as if the bell had newly woken to a bad dream. The first peal crashed into the nave like a wave. The second arrived too soon. The third rang with a shudder in it. The congregation stiffened. Mr. Braithwaite's expression flickered, and the woman in the sable collar looked toward the tower with bright interest. On the fifth peal, something happened. Perhaps only a change in rhythm, perhaps a discord impossible to name, and a murmur rose like wind over wheat. The seventh peal did not come at all. In its place there was an abrupt, dreadful sound, a flurried thumping, a rope whipping, and then a heavy human crash. For half a second nobody moved. The vicar stood with his mouth slightly open. Mrs. Dodd clapped a gloved hand to her throat. Miss Marple, who had heard a good many sounds in her life and knew the difference between those made by objects and those with bone in them, felt a small cold clarity pass through her. "Ezra," the vicar said at last. "Horse," and the verger hurried down the side aisle, followed by 2 or 3 men, among them Tom Reeves and Mr. Braithwaite, who recovered his composure as smartly as he had lost it. Miss Marple did not hurry. She was never one for pushing through crowds. She observed instead, as people will when they are trying not to be frightened, the little particulars. Mrs. Ames had a parcel under her arm wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, the twine, Miss Marple noted, frayed rather badly in one place. The woman in sable had taken off a glove and tucked it into her muff. There was a faint smudge on the glove, something dark that did not look like soot. Mr. Pottle's beard trembled in a way that made him seem suddenly venerable, and the bell rope swinging, visible now as the vestry door was flung open, had snagged a thread of wool, blue, scratchy, the sort sold in the village shop, on a protruding nail. They brought him out on a circle of cloaks, a man stretched ungainly, head lolling, the bell rope still tracing the space where he had been. Ned Pollock's dark hair was raked back from his forehead. There was a livid mark about his throat, and a dreadful stillness where a young man should be all pliant energy. The congregation, with the strange, careful quiet of people at the edge of disaster, folded away from the sight like a curtain drawing back. "Fetch Dr. Hayward," Mrs. Dodd said, suddenly practical, and someone went running. The vicar, white to the lips, began a prayer which broke once and was resumed. Tom Reeves knelt, his face rigid with shock, and Mr. Braithwaite stood above them with the expression of a man to whom an inconvenience has arrived in public. "It looks," Mrs. Hartnell whispered, already trembling with the vigor of a conclusion, "like an accident. The rope, a slip." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently. "Accidents do occur, to be sure." And yet she did not finish. Her gaze, mild and faintly near-sighted, had lifted to the gallery window above the vestry, where one small pane showed a curious scallop of frost, disturbed by a shape that might have been a hand not very long ago. But it would not do to mention that just now, with the vicar praying and Mrs. Dodd briskly directing, and the village's breath drawing in and out as if they shared one lung, Mrs. Clarissa Fane had come quite near. She looked down at the still form, and then up at Mr. Braithwaite with a glint of something like irony. "How perfectly ghastly," she murmured. "Is this the local idea of a festive peal?" Mr. Braithwaite coloured. "It is a tragic mishap," he said shortly, as if the solidity of his voice might render it so. "Ned should not have been ringing alone. I expressly— Mrs. Ames, the postmistress, had joined them. Her cheeks were bright beneath her hat. "I heard you say only last week you preferred it done without the older men, what with their creaking joints. We must have youth, you said." "Those were your exact words." "Not quite my exact words," Mr. Braithwaite retorted. "In any case, this is not a moment for quarrelling," Mrs. Fane suggested lightly. "How dreary." "I should have thought sorrow more becoming." "Clarissa," Mrs. Dodd said sharply. She knelt and drew the cloak higher about Ned's shoulders, with a motherliness that made Miss Marple's throat ache for a moment. For kindness is always a small shock when one is braced for sense. The doctor came, and with the finality of men in spectacles, he said there was nothing to be done. The congregation began to drift, some of them with relief at having something to do. Fetch warm water, make suggestions, recount what they had heard. What they had heard differed. Some swore the bell rang 6 times, others 7 with a pause. One old man was quite certain it began with a double. In such matters Miss Marple knew certainty was a giddy companion. "Home, I think, Mrs. Hartnell," Miss Marple said softly. "The night will not be improved by standing in it." She looked again very simply at Ned's face, which had not had time to forget being alive. Then she let her eyes travel once more across the little field of human expression. Mr. Braithwaite, striving to appear in command. Mrs. Fane, bright as a new penny and twice as hard. Tom Reeves, tight-lipped with something that might be grief or might be fear. Mrs. Ames, subdued but attentive, as if she were waiting for a telegram whose subject she already knew. A draught nosed along the aisle. In it, a single fir needle loosened itself from a bough and dropped neatly onto the stone at Miss Marple's feet. She stooped, picked it up, and as one does, placed it in her pocket beside the small ball of blue wool she kept there for mending. It made the lightest of company. Outside, snow was falling again, more decisively now, as if the rehearsal had ended and the main performance began. In the tower the bell was still, and for the moment, so was the village. But Miss Marple, who had heard the bell with the ear of a woman who has spent her life noticing how things are when people believe themselves unobserved, knew that stillness did not last. It never did. Not in gardens, not in drawing-rooms, not in churches, and least of all in villages where everyone thought they knew one another. "Odd," she murmured, scarcely aware she had spoken. "What is odd, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Hartnell demanded. "Only that it is Christmas," Miss Marple said, her voice mild as ever, "and one so seldom expects the bell to ring as if it were afraid." She turned her steps toward home. Behind her in the nave, a scrap of blue wool hung unnoticed. From a nail near the swaying rope, trembling faintly in the breath of the church, the lane to the high street lay white and powder soft, and the hush upon it was of the sort that seems to come only after music. Miss Marple walked at her usual steady pace, tapping the end of her umbrella, though there was no rain to excuse it. Snow fell so gently that it seemed the sky had changed its mind and was trying not to disturb anyone. At the corner by the grocer's, a lamp gave a modest glow. Beneath it the snow had been pressed by many feet, some broad and blundering with purpose, some neat and mincing like a cat's. One pair of impressions, rather long in the stride, had cut away from the church path to skirt the hedge and cross toward the meadows. They were not recent. A thin, fresh sift lay already in them, as if the night were keen to tidy what people left untidy. "Tom Reeves went like the wind," Mrs. Hartnell said, puffing beside her, the moment Dr. Hayward had spoken. "Young men can never bear to stand still." "Young men seldom can," Miss Marple murmured. "It quite goes against their joints." At her gate she bade Mrs. Hartnell good night and went in. The little house smelled, as such houses will on winter nights, of warm copper and the clean dryness of polished wood. She set water on for tea, and while it heated laid aside her hat and scarf, patting her hair with the brisk vanity of an old lady who remains on good terms with her mirror. She felt the small ball of blue wool in her pocket and thought, without yet knowing why, that it was a comfort. She slept. Afterward, but it was a practical sleep, the kind in which one does not forget to wake early. On Christmas morning the snow had decided itself. Hedges were heavy, and the roofs wore new caps. The world had been pressed between clean sheets. Smoke went up straight from chimneys, as if the sky had finally agreed to receive it. Miss Marple, who permitted herself a little piece of shortbread with her first tea at Christmas, ate it dutifully and then, with an old lady's economy of motion, put on boots and a stout coat and walked toward the church. There was a bustle at St. Mildred's. The vestry door stood wide, and Ezra Pottle, the verger, moved about with a broom like a man who means to remove not only dust but memory. His beard looked older in daylight, so did he. In the porch, Mrs. Dodd and two ladies from the Mothers' Union were regrouping the stubborn poinsettia and discussing the advisability of bringing out the lesser manger from the parish room, on account of tastelessness being better borne than tragedy. Mrs. Dodd said, and Miss Marple agreed that sometimes the eye requires occupation. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Dodd said with grateful purpose, "would you be so kind as to look in on Mrs. Pollock later? She will not come down. Ned's sister is with her, but, well," she lowered her voice, "when youth dies suddenly it makes an untidy absence in a house." "I shall take some broth," Miss Marple said, and a practical tone. "They sometimes help, if one keeps them very soft." "Inspector Slack has sent word," Mrs. Dodd added, with the air of one delivering both news and an apology. "He is on his way from Much Benham. He telephoned the vicar at 8. I suppose there must be an inquest." "There generally is," Miss Marple said. "It is one of the things England does very steadily." She went into the nave. Cold had retaken it. Yesterday's warmth seemed a dream one had talked oneself into. The bell rope hung quiet, its sally of braided wool at the proper height, colours muted in the pale light. The vestry door's iron latch bore a small smear, very slight, of something dark. Miss Marple leaned near, not touching. It might have been the innocuous grease one finds on door furniture in winter. Her gaze drifted up to the gallery window. Frost had drawn its usual ferny landscapes, except for a portion near the lower right, where a hand or a sleeve had smudged the pattern to translucence. She had seen it last night, and seeing it again, liked it no better. Ezra Pottle, who never could resist the impulse to make a statement resemble a proverb, came shuffling toward her with his broom. "It was a sad providence, ma'am," he announced. "A sad providence, I say, but providence nonetheless. Rope can catch a man as quick as sin." "Rope can," Miss Marple agreed gently, "and sin quicker still." He blinked at that, and his ancient face made a creased attempt at reassessment. The boy had a way of doing things in his own manner. "Wouldn't do as I told him always. 'Ezra,' I says, 'there's ways to coil a rope proper and ways to invite the devil to your elbow.' He'd laugh. He had a laugh like brass, he did. Fine ringer, though, fine." "Who else rings?" Miss Marple asked. "The vicar said last night, well, there was a suggestion the older men were to rest their joints." The verger's broom paused mid-sweep. "Mr. Braithwaite's notion. All zeal, that one. New frame, new peel, and new blood to pull it. Youth is well and good, ma'am, but bells don't thank you for it. They like knowing hands, bells do. They're like cows. They won't be hurried." I told him as much. "And was Mr. Braithwaite here after the rehearsal yesterday?" Miss Marple's tone was conversational, the sort women use when they mean nothing and everything. "In and out," Ezra said with reluctance. "Looked in at the fittings. He has the extra key for the tower on account of the refit. So do I. So did Ned." Miss Marple let her eyes travel as if idly to the nail by the rope where the scrap of blue wool had snagged. It was there still, a harsh little tuft. She reached into her pocket and felt her own yarn under her glove. The contrast, soft versus scratchy, settled something in her mind. The colours were close but not the same. Bell ropes had their own plaits and dyes. The village shop sold a practical, obstinate blue that took the sort of dye one uses for school jumpers. This Tuft was that sort. "Mrs. Ames opens the shop this morning?" she asked, still mild. "On Christmas?" Ezra looked shocked, recovered, and then admitted, "For an hour she does, so folks can fetch what they've forgot. She says charity begins where a tin of treacle ends." "Quite so." Miss Marple moved nearer the vestry door. There, upon the stone by the hinge, lay a minute crumble of something like grit, but darker. Resinous, perhaps. She did not touch it. She had learned long ago that to touch is to give oneself away. There was a stir at the porch. The vicar, white and earnest, came in with a man who wore his hat as if every head were an inconvenience, and who had the habit, so trying in officials, of looking around rooms as if they owed him money. Inspector Slack had not, Miss Marple reflected, improved in charm. Perhaps one could not expect him to. He greeted her with the politeness suitable to a respectable old lady, whose acuity one did not wish to encourage. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, and then, brisk to Ezra, "No one touches anything. Doctor's seen the body. We'll have it removed in due course. Fergia, you say the deceased was alone when he rang?" "I was in the porch," Ezra said. "As near as makes no odds to alone." Slack sniffed. "And the rope took him." He shot a glance at the rope, at the nail with its blue tuft at the window. "Happens. Fool's accident. I'll have the ringers in and take their statements." "Poor Ned was not a fool," Mrs. Dodd said quietly from the aisle. "He was impulsive." "Those are not always the same thing." Slack, who disliked having his nouns corrected by vicars' wives, made a note with a pencil that seemed to cut the paper rather than write upon it. He conceded Miss Marple a neutral nod, then addressed the vicar. "Names of all present, please, especially those near the vestry when it happened." "Mr. Braithwaite was among the first," the vicar offered, "and Tom Reeves, and Mrs. Clarissa Fane," Mrs. Dodd added, with a calm that was almost relish. "A stranger among us, Inspector. One notices." "Strangers do get noticed," Slack said, and Miss Marple thought that sometimes that was their sole defense. When they had finished speaking where speaking was needed, Miss Marple slipped away. It is not the business of a sensible woman to stand under a policeman's nose. Outside, the morning was pale and precise. She went first to the Pollocks' cottage, where grief had settled with the punctuality of an unwelcome guest. Ned's mother was a woman of sparse words. She sat as if time had gone out of practice. Miss Marple spoke softly about broth and the necessity of resting one's eyes between tears, and she tidied a few things which liked to be tidied. And when she came away, she knew that sorrow had been neither lessened nor offended. That is sometimes the best one can do. From there she passed to the post office. The little bell over the door rang self-importantly. Mrs. Ames, brisk and pink with the cold, was dispensing string and stamps with the air of a magistrate issuing minor sentences. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Grim business." She leaned closer. "They say it was the rope, but ropes aren't wicked of themselves. Its hands make things wicked." "Hands and purposes," Miss Marple agreed. She looked along the shelf where yarn sat in patient balls. There it was, the blue she knew, practical, unlovely, exact. "I wanted to ask," she added, as if on the tail of another thought, "whether you have sold much of that this week." Mrs. Ames glanced up sharply, then down. "Some. Mrs. Penrith took a pair on Tuesday to knit for the mission. And, let me see, Tom Reeves bought a little on Wednesday. Said he wanted to mend a pull on a scarf. He looked as if a scarf would mend him better. Tom is trying to be respectable," Miss Marple said. "Respectability often begins with scarves." She paused. "And Mrs. Fane?" "The lady with the sable collar?" Mrs. Ames's eyes brightened. "It is not given to postmistresses to remain indifferent to names. Yarn? No. Twine? Yes. Late last evening after tea. Said she had a parcel that wanted a better tie. She's one for appearances. Asked if the bell frame could be seen from the gallery, and whether one could get up to it without getting in people's way. I told her we were a village, not a theatre." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "Twine, then." She thought of the phrase she had noticed on Mrs. Ames's own parcel in the church. "Your twine does not always behave, I see." It behaves well enough if people don't yank, Mrs. Ames retorted. I've told the vicar we ought to have a better nail to hang the Christmas notices. The one in the vestry catches everything. Snatched a bit from my parcel last night. She clucked at the memory. Untidy business. Miss Marple bought a packet of note cards she did not need and went out. Snow hushed the road of its small vanities. She stood a moment, considering the tower against the pale sky and the window with its smudged frost, a parcel needing better twine. A nail that snatched, a rope that took a man, a stranger with a smudge on her glove, youth heading for the meadows at a run, and Mr. Braithwaite, zealous and square, with a key and a gift to present to posterity. One learns, Miss Marple reflected, that when people talk of accidents, they sometimes mean conveniences. She turned her steps toward the Blue Boar. Tom Reeves would be there. He would pretend not to be, but he would. And it is a peculiar mercy of small villages that men who wish to be found are invariably found in the first or second place one looks. The Blue Boar stood at the edge of the green, its sign creaking faintly in the cold wind. Inside it was warm and full of the subdued murmur that follows a village tragedy. People spoke softly, but their eyes shone with the relief of having something to talk about. Miss Marple pushed open the door, brushing the snow from her coat, and nodded to Mr. Cribbins, the landlord, who had the good sense not to question why she had come. He simply offered a polite "Good morning, Miss Marple," and gestured toward the far end, where a single lamp burned low over an unpolished table. Tom Reeves sat there, his hair rumpled, and his face pale beneath the sunburn of the outdoorsman. A half-drunk pint stood before him forgotten. He looked up when she approached, his eyes full of that nervous defiance young men assume when they suspect the world of judging them. "Well now, Tom," Miss Marple said pleasantly, unbuttoning her gloves. "A cold morning to be out and about, but I thought a walk might warm one better than a fire. You don't mind if I sit a moment, do you?" He mumbled something like "Course not," and she seated herself with the gentle authority that had soothed countless Sunday school boys into confession. "It's a terrible thing," she continued, in her soft, companionable way. "Poor Ned, I dare say you were friends." Tom stared into the glass. "We worked together sometimes. On the bell frame when it was being mended. He was the better hand. I only helped because Mr. Braithwaite wanted younger men." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said, nodding. "Mr. Braithwaite seems to value youth, though perhaps youth doesn't always value him." A faint twitch crossed Tom's mouth. "He's all right, I suppose. Thinks he owns the place already, always telling people what's proper and what isn't. Ned didn't take kindly to that. Said the bells weren't his to order about." "I can imagine," Miss Marple said. "There's an art to bells like to everything else. They have their tempers, I think." He nodded, still looking down. Ned said the same. "He said you had to treat them like ladies. Firm hand, gentle voice." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Guess he found one that didn't like him." Miss Marple sipped the tea that Mr. Cribbins had quietly brought. "You were at the church last night," she said in a tone that carried no accusation, only interest. Tom looked up sharply. "I was. Everyone was. You saw me." "Yes," she agreed mildly. "I also saw you leave rather quickly afterward." His throat worked as he swallowed. "Didn't seem much point staying, did there? I've never seen a man look like that before." "I had to get out." "Quite understandable," she said. "It is not easy to stand near death, especially when one has been so close to life. But tell me, when you left, did you go straight home?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, home." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him kindly. "And not, say, across the meadow path?" "I only ask because the snow keeps such good memory of our wanderings." He flushed a dull red. Yes, I cut across, all right. I didn't want to meet the others coming down the main road. Thought they'd be talking." "People do talk," Miss Marple said. "It is one of the few reliable certainties of existence." "And so you took the meadow path." Her tone grew quieter. "Did you see anyone?" He shook his head too quickly. "No one." Then, after a pause, "There was someone ahead of me, though. Couldn't say who. A woman, I think, had something dark around her shoulders. She turned off before the stile. Mrs. Fane, perhaps, Miss Marple murmured as though to herself. He looked startled. You think, I think one must not think too quickly, she said. It is how the wrong people get hanged. He swallowed again. You're like the inspector, then? Not at all, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. The inspector believes in evidence. I believe in people. They seldom change, you know. Circumstances change, but not character. For a moment he looked at her, as though trying to decide whether she was simple or terribly wise. Then his shoulders sagged. Ned wasn't the sort to do himself in, if that's what some think. He'd too much pride. I never thought otherwise, Miss Marple said softly. Ropes don't knot themselves, and bells don't ring out of fear unless there's a reason. Mr. Cribbins appeared with a dishcloth and began polishing the counter in a manner that meant he was listening. The talk in the corner quieted, as it always does when the conversation nearest the truth begins to sound interesting. Miss Marple rose, slipping her gloves back on. Thank you, Tom. You've been very helpful. He looked surprised. I haven't said anything. Oh, but you have, she said gently. Sometimes what one doesn't say is most enlightening. She smiled that mild, unthreatening smile that always left people uncertain whether she had noticed too much or not quite enough, and went out into the snow. The air was sharper now, the sun pale and cold behind the clouds. She walked back toward the green, thinking about what Tom had said. A woman in a dark wrap turning off before the stile, a scrap of blue wool caught on a nail, a frayed twine on a parcel that should have been neatly tied, and the uneven ringing of the bell, a pattern of hesitation and haste. At the vicarage gate she met Mrs. Dodd again, carrying a tray of mince pies for the Pollocks. Her face was pinched with weariness, and the kind of worry that settles into the corners of the mouth. Have you heard, Miss Marple? Inspector Slack says it was most likely an accident. Ned must have misjudged the rope and, well, you can imagine. Yes, Miss Marple said. I can imagine many things, though I find that imagination, like dough, must rise before it proves useful. Mrs. Dodd gave her a puzzled look, sighed, and went on. Miss Marple continued toward her gate, her eyes following the faint line of footprints that led from the churchyard path toward the Braithwaite cottage. They were deep, firm, and singularly unhurried. When she reached her own garden, she paused and looked back once more toward the tower. Its bells, so recently jubilant, hung silent now beneath the winter sky. Yet she fancied that if one listened carefully enough, one might still hear the ghost of their unsteady peal, the sound of something that had gone wrong at exactly the right time. She went inside, shut the door behind her, and took from her pocket the tiny tuft of blue wool she had found in the church. Under the lamp it looked darker, almost black. She set it beside her own soft yarn and nodded to herself as though the two threads had just introduced one another. Then, with the calm of a woman who has seen more sin than surprise, she reached for her knitting needles. It will come out in the wash, she murmured. It always does. And as she began to knit, the click of the needle sounded very like the patient ticking of thought. That afternoon the snow eased into a light mist, and the village lay in that peculiar half-silence that falls when gossip is momentarily exhausted but not forgotten. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting with small, decisive movements. The grey light caught the fine wrinkles at the corner of her eyes and the slight downturn of her mouth, which meant she was thinking rather harder than usual. Each stitch seemed to bring her closer to something not yet visible, but beginning to take shape, as patterns do when one has patience to wait. The faint sound of a knock at her door interrupted the rhythm. When she opened it, she found Inspector Slack on her step, hat in hand, looking as if he had been driven there by both duty and mild irritation. He was not a man who came to Miss Marple for pleasure. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said. "You're about, I see. Thought you'd like to know we've finished at the church. Doctor's report says the lad was strangled before he fell. Rope burns too clean for a slip. We'll treat it as suspicious." Miss Marple inclined her head, as if he had merely confirmed what she had already told herself. "I'm sorry to hear it, though I can't say I'm surprised. Bells seldom tell lies. They only speak too plainly for some ears. Slack frowned. Yes, well, that's as may be. You've probably heard half the village has its theories. Some say he'd enemies over that girl from the Blue Boar. Others that he found out something about Braithwaite's finances. For most of it nonsense, of course. I dare say, Miss Marple said. And yet one seldom finds nonsense without a kernel of something smaller and sharper inside. He gave her a narrow look. You always have your own way of putting things. Any ideas of your own? Miss Marple smiled her small, prim smile. Oh, only notions, Inspector. The sort of things that occur to one when mending a tear. One sees where the strain began, and one wonders who was tugging at the cloth. Slack sighed, clearly regretting his decision to call. We'll be questioning Mr. Braithwaite again. He was the last known to have the tower keys. Claims he left them in the vestry after the service. I'll have to check his story. Oh, and that Mrs. Fane, the lady with the fur collar, she's leaving on the evening train. I'll stop her before she does. Seems an odd sort to take an interest in village bells. Miss Marple tilted her head. Indeed, most women of her kind prefer music they can command. The sound of bells has its own mind. Do give her my compliments, Inspector. And if you find yourself in need of tea, I've just baked a little fruit loaf. He grunted something that might have been thanks, though he did not accept. When he had gone, Miss Marple stood for a moment at the door, watching his footprints vanish into the pale distance. Then she turned briskly to her coat and scarf. There were 2 calls she meant to make before dark. One for information, the other for intuition. The first brought her to Mr. Braithwaite's cottage, a neat square house that seemed to stand to attention, even in the snow. Its windows were bright, its path cleared, and the scent of polish lingered about it like discipline. Mr. Braithwaite himself opened the door, his face controlled but tired, the kind of tired that comes from being watched. Miss Marple, he said, attempting politeness, this is hardly a social hour. I'm sorry to intrude, but I thought perhaps I might pay my respects, she said gently. Such dreadful business at the church, and on Christmas Eve of all nights. I thought perhaps you could tell me how poor Ned came to be ringing alone. His jaw tightened. He insisted. Said he didn't need supervision. I'd asked him to run a short test of the new fittings before the service. Nothing dangerous, I assure you. If I'd known. He stopped, the rest lost in a strained breath. Miss Marple watched him, her blue eyes clear and deceptively soft. You were fond of him, then? I respected his skill. Fondness has little to do with it. Quite, she said. Skill often makes its owners proud. And pride, like bells, can turn deaf when handled roughly. He frowned, uncertain of her meaning. If you're suggesting— Not suggesting, she said, smiling. Merely observing. It's remarkable, isn't it, how tragedy reveals the precise point where people's interests cross. Her gaze flicked to a framed photograph on the mantel, a younger Mr. Braithwaite, shaking hands with a man in front of a foundry. You knew him a long time? My business partner. He passed years ago. Why? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple said. Only that grief leaves its echoes in curious places. She thanked him, declined his offer of a cab home, and took her leave. The second call was more instinctive. Instead of turning toward her lane, she crossed the green to the little house Mrs. Fane had rented. It stood aloof, with shutters drawn though the lamps were lit inside. Miss Marple knocked, and after a moment Mrs. Fane herself appeared, looking exquisite even in fatigue, her dark wrap about her shoulders, and a hint of perfume that seemed almost defiant in the cold air. Miss Marple, she said lightly, what an unexpected pleasure. Have you come to wish me farewell? I'm leaving this evening, you know. Yes, Inspector Slack mentioned it, Miss Marple said. Such a pity to leave before the mystery resolves itself. I imagine few things are harder than walking away from unanswered questions. Mrs. Fane's lips curved. Oh, I rather think mystery is overrated. It suits stories better than life. In life, most things are simply dull or cruel. Cruelty does have its place, Miss Marple said softly, though it seldom looks cruel at the time. More often it looks like practicality. Mrs. Fane's hand stilled on the doorknob. "You have a way of sounding harmless while being anything but, Miss Marple." "Is that how you amuse yourself here?" "At my age, my dear, one must find diversions where one can," Miss Marple smiled. "And sometimes when people insist on rushing away, it's because something here has not yet finished with them." For a heartbeat, Mrs. Fane's composure flickered. Then she laughed, though her voice was thin. "How deliciously ominous. You'll make me miss my train if you go on like that." Miss Marple inclined her head and stepped back. "I shouldn't dream of detaining you. Only before you go, you might look to your gloves. There's a smudge, you know, just at the wrist. One notices such things in daylight." Mrs. Fane glanced down quickly, then recovered herself. "You have very sharp eyes for so gentle a woman." "One must in villages," Miss Marple said. "It's the only way to keep one's knitting straight." As she walked home through the deepening dusk, the snow began to fall again, softly and insistently, like the settling of dust after a great disturbance. She could hear the distant murmur of the church bell tower creaking in the wind. Inside her pocket, the small tuft of blue wool felt heavier than its weight, a quiet witness waiting to be called. And Miss Marple, with her steady, knowing steps, began to see how the strands might yet be drawn together into a single, deadly pattern. Morning came reluctantly, pale and hesitant, as though the sun itself were uncertain whether it wished to shine upon such uneasy hearts. The snow lay untouched over the green, softening the sharp edges of cottages and hedgerows, making even grief appear muffled. Miss Marple was awake early, as she always was when her mind had not finished its business. The kettle sang to her in the quiet kitchen, and she poured her tea with a hand that trembled only slightly, not from age, but from thought. Her mind lingered, as it had all night, on Mrs. Fane's poised face and the smudge on her glove. It was not the kind of mark one gained from soot or dust. It had an oiliness to it, something that reminded her of the rope's fibres, greased and darkened by years of use. She thought also of Mr. Braithwaite's precise manner, of how easily he dismissed emotion as untidy. And then there was young Tom Reeves, so raw with guilt and uncertainty that one almost pitied him. People often underestimated the weight of knowing without understanding. A knock came at her door, a brisk, no-nonsense rapping that announced Inspector Slack. He entered without waiting for invitation, stamping the snow from his boots. "Morning, Miss Marple." "You're up early." "Thought you'd like to know. We found something in the bell tower." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Oh, how interesting. And on Christmas morning, too. I do hope it's not another body." Slack grimaced. "Nothing so dramatic. A piece of twine tied round the upper rung of the ladder. Bit of it was caught in the beam. Looks like it was used to fix something, perhaps the bell rope before it slipped." He paused, looking almost sheepish. "You mentioned twine yesterday, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled mildly. "I do find it a most suggestive material, Inspector. It holds things together, and sometimes holds secrets, too. Did you happen to notice if it matched the sort Mrs. Ames sells?" He frowned. "Can't say I did, but we've got it down at the station. I've already sent for Braithwaite to come in. And Mrs. Fane. The two of them seem to know more than they're saying." "I expect they do," Miss Marple said softly. "But the more important question is, do they know they know?" Slack gave her a long look, as though deciding whether to ignore the remark or take it as another of her cryptic clues. He opted for neither and simply muttered, "We'll see," before tramping off again. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned to her knitting basket and drew out the little tuft of blue wool she had found in the church. It was coarse, meant for work clothes, not scarves or gloves. The kind of yarn used for mending something, rather than making it beautiful. She placed it beside a small length of twine from her kitchen drawer and smiled faintly. Each thread different, yet both with the same purpose, to bind. By the time she arrived at the vicarage later that morning, the village was already humming with speculation. Mrs. Dodd was on the path, her face set in that mixture of solemnity and curiosity. so particular to people who have seen too much tragedy, but still relish its orderliness. "Have you heard, Miss Marple? They're saying Ned might have been fixing something in the tower when it happened. A loose beam, perhaps. And Mrs. Fane, well, she's been questioned again. Seems she had some business in the city with Mr. Braithwaite once." "Imagine that," Miss Marple nodded gravely. "People's paths cross in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes they do not meet again until life or death forces them to." Inside the vicarage, the air was warm with the smell of baking. The vicar himself, looking thinner than usual, welcomed her with weary gratitude. "It's such a terrible affair, Miss Marple. Ned was a fine boy. The congregation will want some explanation, any explanation, before the service tomorrow." "I imagine so," she said. "It is human nature to seek comfort in reasons, even when they're not the right ones. I wonder, though, did you notice anything strange in the church last evening after everyone had left?" He frowned. "Only that the vestry door was slightly ajar when I went back in later. I assumed it was the draught. And, oh yes, there was a faint smell of turpentine. I remember thinking it odd, but perhaps it was from the polish we used on the pews." "Turpentine," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That would explain the smudge on Mrs. Fane's glove, I think." The vicar blinked. "Her glove? Never mind," she said gently. "It may be nothing at all, but her mind was far from nothing. Turpentine was used to clean oil and varnish, also to remove grease. A woman might use it if she had handled a rope or machinery and wished to disguise the evidence. Mrs. Fane's visit to the tower, her interest in the bell frame, the twine she had bought, all small, ordinary things. Yet ordinary things, Miss Marple knew, often made up the strongest noose. She left the vicarage and crossed to the churchyard. The snow had begun to thaw in places, revealing damp earth beneath. Near the lych gate she paused, noticing the faint outline of footprints leading from the tower door toward the back hedge. One pair was large, boots, she thought, belonging to a man. The other, lighter, narrower, a woman's tread. They met briefly and then diverged. She followed the smaller set toward the wall, where a loose stone jutted out. Something caught the light, an object lodged in the crack. She bent and prized it free. It was a small brass button, finely made, with a crest engraved upon it. Not the sort found on village clothing. She turned it over in her hand and her eyes narrowed. "Ah," she murmured. "How very careless of you, my dear." By the time she reached home, dusk had fallen. The sound of the evening bell, rung by Ezra Pottle now, slow and steady, echoed through the still air. Miss Marple lit her lamp and laid the brass button beside the blue wool and a short piece of twine she had taken from her drawer. 3 small things, each meaningless alone, but together forming the shape of something grimly deliberate. She sat down, folded her hands, and allowed the pattern to settle in her mind. The twine to tie, the wool to catch, the button to betray. She could almost hear the bell again as it had sounded that night, wild, uneven, desperate. Not the cry of a man losing balance, but of one calling for help too late. Miss Marple sighed softly, a sound like pity. So it was not the rope that failed, she whispered to herself. It was trust. Then she rose, fetched her shawl, and reached for her hat. It was time, she thought, to pay one last visit, before the inspector reached his own, rather simpler conclusion. The night was crisp, with the faint gleam of stars pricking through a gauze of drifting cloud. Miss Marple moved along the lane toward the Braithwaite house, with that gentle determination that always gave her the air of simply taking a constitutional, though her purpose tonight was of another sort entirely. The snow underfoot had crusted to a thin sheen, and her breath showed faintly in the air like the sighs of someone remembering too much. She carried no candle, only her small walking lamp, its light dim enough not to startle those who might be watching from windows. When she reached the gate, she saw that the curtains inside were drawn, but one lamp burned low. She rapped delicately. Mr. Braithwaite answered almost at once, wearing a dressing gown and an expression of weary surprise. "Miss Marple, at this hour?" he exclaimed. Surely this could have waited till morning. Miss Marple smiled apologetically, the very image of polite intrusion. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, Mr. Braithwaite, but you see I've been thinking about poor Ned, and something rather curious occurred to me. It's always best, I find, to speak before ideas go stale overnight." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Well, if it's brief." She entered the sitting room. The fire was nearly out, and a faint smell of polish lingered. Mr. Braithwaite's house always smelled of polish, as if even his grief must be orderly. She noticed as she sat a coat thrown over a chair. It was the sort worn for practical work, stout wool, brass buttons dulled with age. Her eyes lingered on them just long enough to confirm what she had suspected, the same crest she had seen engraved on the one she'd found by the church wall. "I fear," Miss Marple began, folding her hands, "that people are very ready to see tragedy in simple accidents, yet life has taught me that accidents are quite uncommon. They are simply acts of intention concealed behind the veil of happenstance." He gave a short laugh, though it sounded forced. "I'm afraid I'm not following you." "Then let me put it plainly," she said gently. "Ned Pollock did not die because of a loose rope or foolish misstep. He died because someone feared he had seen or perhaps said something he oughtn't to." He stared at her, eyes wary. "That's absurd. Ned was a good boy, but impulsive. The doctor's report—" "Yes, I know," Miss Marple said, cutting across him with quiet firmness. "He was strangled before he fell. One wonders then who was in the tower with him." His face stiffened, the muscles about his mouth tightening like a man hearing his own footsteps behind him in the dark. "Herr Inspector Slack has already asked me that," he said. "I told him I left before the service, that I went home to fetch my notes. I have nothing to add." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you did not go straight home, did you? You met someone in the churchyard, a woman. You see, Mr. Braithwaite, the snow keeps a better account than people do." He rose sharply, his voice roughening. "This is nonsense." "Not at all," she replied, still mild. "You see, the footprints tell their story. Yours, strong, deliberate, met hers near the wall. Then you parted. I think you gave her something. Perhaps the twine the inspector found tied about the beam. It would make sense. You are, after all, quite skilled with knots. The bell frame was your design, was it not?" The silence stretched. His jaw worked, but words refused to come. Miss Marple continued as gently as if she were describing a misplaced teapot. "Mrs. Fane had reason to help you. You knew each other long before she came to St. Mary Mead. A little business arrangement in London, I believe, which ended rather badly when your accounts were, shall we say, uneven." He drew in a sharp breath. "So you've no proof of that?" "I don't need proof," Miss Marple said, almost kindly. "Only patterns. You see, people never quite change. When Mrs. Fane followed you here, I imagine she meant to use that old knowledge for her own benefit. But then Ned saw her or you at the tower that evening, when he came early to ring the bells. He must have threatened to speak. So between you it was decided that he would not. The man's composure crumbled like ice breaking on a pond. So you think she—" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes steady. "I think you did it. But she was there to help after, to steady the rope perhaps, to fix the twine to make it appear as though the rope had caught him by chance. And the twine, well, you bought none, but she did. You both left your marks, you know. The wool snagged on the nail was from your sleeve. Your work coat has the same coarse blue lining. The brass button from it fell when you brushed past the wall. The bell spoke the truth, though no one wished to hear it." Mr. Braithwaite sank into the chair, face grey and hands trembling. "He mocked me," he said hoarsely. "Called me a fraud before the boy who helped me fit the frame. Said he'd tell the village I'd stolen the design. I only meant to frighten him, to make him listen." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her tone remained even. And yet, as so often happens, fear turns swiftly to finality. "You pulled too hard. The rope slipped, and there it was, irrevocable." He put his head in his hands. "I never wanted it to end like that." "I know," she said. "No one ever does. Evil is seldom deliberate at the start. It begins with wounded pride or fear or vanity, but it always ends the same way. Outside faintly came the crunch of boots on snow, the sound of Inspector Slack's arrival. Miss Marple rose, straightened her gloves, and gave a small sigh. "It's best you tell him the truth, Mr. Braithwaite. He's not nearly as patient as I am." She let herself out quietly, the cold air rushing against her cheeks. As she walked home beneath the ghostly shimmer of the moon, the church bell gave one solemn toll, carried by the wind like an echo of conscience. Miss Marple paused at her gate and looked back once, her breath misting before her. "The bell never lies," she murmured. Then she went inside, where the lamp still burned, and her knitting waited, the blue wool coiled neatly in its basket, patient as the end of a story well told. The following morning, a thin veil of frost lay over the village, quieting even the sparrows. St. Mary Mead had the hushed air of a place that had both gossiped and prayed itself to exhaustion. News, it seemed, travelled faster than forgiveness. By the time Miss Marple set out for her morning walk, everyone knew or believed they knew that Mr. Braithwaite had confessed. But there were murmurs too, uneasy ones that slipped between the hedgerows like a draught under a door. Some said Mrs. Fane had helped him. Others whispered she was the real culprit, the one who'd drawn him into wickedness. People, Miss Marple reflected as she walked toward the post office, were rarely satisfied with only one sinner. The little bell above the post office door jingled its usual self-important tune as she stepped inside. Mrs. Ames was sorting envelopes at the counter, her mouth pursed into a shape that suggested she had both questions and opinions to spare. "Miss Marple," she greeted, with the air of someone who had just been thinking of her. "Terrible business, isn't it? The police came by last night. Said Mr. Braithwaite's to be taken into custody. And that woman, Mrs. Fane, off on the early train this morning. That's not the behaviour of an innocent lady, if you ask me." "I dare say not," Miss Marple said mildly, adjusting her scarf. "And yet one must remember that guilt and flight are not always companions. Some people run from disgrace, others from boredom. Mrs. Fane strikes me as more prone to the latter." Mrs. Ames sniffed. "Well, boredom or no, she bought that twine here. And if it was used for wicked purposes, I shouldn't like to have it on my conscience." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, conscience is a most elastic thing, Mrs. Ames. It stretches to fit our sympathies. Though in this case I think you've nothing to trouble yourself about. The twine was merely a tool, not a cause." Mrs. Ames seemed half appeased, half frustrated that her small connection to the scandal was being so easily dismissed. "You don't believe she helped him, then?" Miss Marple hesitated, her knitting bag hanging lightly at her wrist. "I believe she helped herself, as such women generally do. But as for helping him, well, sometimes a person stands by in silence, and silence can be the loudest encouragement of all." Outside, the frost was melting, dripping from eaves and branches with a delicate rhythm, like a clock ticking away guilt. Miss Marple crossed the green toward the church, where she could see Inspector Slack talking with Ezra Pottle by the lich gate. Slack's posture was that of a man whose triumph sat uneasily upon him. When he noticed her, his expression softened a fraction, perhaps gratitude, though he would never admit it aloud. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "All wrapped up, I see. You'll have heard Braithwaite's given his statement. He's to be remanded till after the holiday. Never thought I'd see the day. A respectable fellow like him." "Respectability," Miss Marple said, "is like good china. It looks very fine until you drop it." Slack gave a short laugh. "That's one way of putting it. Still, I owe you for that little nudge. Would have taken me days to put it together." "I'm quite sure you'd have managed, Inspector," she said politely. "You have a very decisive mind. I merely knit the loose ends together." He looked as though he might have replied, but Ezra Pottle, hovering anxiously beside them, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but there's talk going round that the bell tower's cursed now. Some say it oughtn't to be rung again, not after what happened." "Superstition, Mr. Pottle," Slack grunted. "Bells don't kill people." Miss Marple looked up at the tower. Its stone was pale and clean against the sky, the great bell within invisible but heavy with memory. "No," she said softly, "bells don't kill. But they do remember, and sometimes when we ring them too soon they tell what we'd rather forget." Slack frowned, half amused, half bewildered. "You've a way of making everything sound like a sermon, Miss Marple. Still, I'll see the tower sealed for a week or two. Give folks time to calm down." As the inspector strode off toward the vicarage, Miss Marple remained where she was, her gaze still fixed on the tower. There was something unfinished about it all, a thread left hanging. Braithwaite's confession had been clear enough. Yes, he had struck out in anger. Yes, he had tried to make it seem an accident. But there was a tone in his account that hadn't rung true. He'd spoken of Mrs. Fane with a kind of bitterness too sharp for guilt and too personal for mere shame. That afternoon, as the light thinned, Miss Marple took her tea by the window and thought again of Mrs. Fane's calm voice, her bright eyes, her poised departure. There had been no remorse in her, no sorrow for a man ruined, nor even for a village shocked. She had spoken as one might after a tedious play, eager only to be done with it. And yet Miss Marple knew such composure was rarely born of innocence. When evening came, she wrapped her shawl more tightly and opened her writing desk. From its drawer she took a single envelope addressed in a bold, slanting hand, Mrs. Clarissa Fane's. It had been delivered that morning, slipped beneath her door. Inside was a short note. "My dear Miss Marple, I thought it best to leave before the village decided what to think of me. I suppose you will understand. As for Mr. Braithwaite, he always did overestimate his cleverness. You were quite right about twine. Such a useful thing in small hands or large. Yours with admiration, C.F." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and laid it beside her knitting. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were bright with quiet certainty. "Ah," she murmured. "So you tied the knot, my dear, and let him pull it." Outside the frost thickened again, whitening the world to silence. In the churchyard, the bell swayed slightly in the wind, though no hand touched it, giving a faint, hollow chime that faded into the night, like a final confession whispered to the dark. The letter lay upon Miss Marple's small oak table long after the last of the daylight had withdrawn from the room. The fire had sunk to a quiet red glow, and the only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the mantel. She read the letter once more, her expression composed but her eyes alert, the way a cat seemed to be even when it appears to be asleep. It was not only what Mrs. Fane had written that caught her attention, it was what she had chosen not to write. The tone of it was the thing, smooth, confident, and very slightly amused. The note was not a farewell. It was a performance, and Miss Marple was rarely deceived by such things. She rose, placed the letter back in its envelope, and drew the curtains. The night pressed softly against the glass, thick with frost. It was the kind of cold that sharpened the mind and made the heart feel fragile. She turned toward her chair, but before she could sit, there was a knock, light, hurried, and unmistakably anxious. When she opened the door, she found Tom Reeves standing there, bareheaded and flushed from haste. "Miss Marple, I didn't know who else to come to," he stammered. "The inspector's gone to Much Benham, and they said I should wait till morning, but I can't. Not after what I found." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "Come in, dear boy. There's a fire still and some tea left in the pot. Tell me what troubles you." Tom stepped inside, brushing the snow from his sleeves, his breath clouding the air. "It's about Mrs. Fane," he said. "Or rather, her luggage. She didn't take all of it. The vicar's maid asked me to fetch a trunk she'd left at the station. The porter said she'd gone off with only a small case, but when I went to move it, the latch was broken and it came open." He swallowed hard. There was a man's watch inside. Ned's, his initials scratched on the back. I'd swear to it anywhere. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched on the arm of her chair, but her fingers moved slightly, as though feeling the rhythm of an invisible pattern. "The curious thing to leave behind," she said softly, "and quite against Mrs. Fane's nature, I should think. She's not the sort of woman to forget something incriminating." Tom nodded miserably. "That's what I thought. Unless she wanted it to be found, Miss Marple looked up at him with interest. "A very good thought, Tom. People who play clever games sometimes forget that others can think too. Tell me, did anyone see you with the trunk?" "Just the porter, and he said it had been there since the morning train. She told him she'd come back for it. He looked worried when I opened it, like he knew he shouldn't have let me. I didn't tell him what was inside." "You did quite right," she said. "There are moments when silence is the best companion to discovery. Now then, did you notice anything else? A smell, perhaps, or any other object?" He frowned. "Yes, turpentine. Strong, like the stuff Mr. Braithwaite used on the wood when the bell frame was fitted. And a piece of cloth, silk, I think, torn at one edge. Looked like it had been ripped from a scarf." Miss Marple leaned back, eyes half closing in thought. "Ah," she murmured. "So she left a trace for us to follow, but not too obvious a one. A woman who leaves a clue is either careless or calculating, and Mrs. Fane is not careless. Tell me, Tom, where is the trunk now?" "In the vestry. The vicar thought it best to keep it locked there until the inspector returns." "Very prudent," she said. "But I think perhaps we ought not to wait for the inspector." Tom blinked. "You mean now?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, rising and wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "Before the frost deepens and memory with it. Truth, like footprints, is best followed while it's fresh." They set out together, their steps muffled in the snow. The church loomed ahead, its windows faintly luminous in the dark. Inside, the air was cold and still, heavy with the faint scent of pine and candle wax. The vestry door creaked as they opened it, revealing the trunk against the wall, squat and dark as a secret waiting to be confessed. Miss Marple bent over it, her gloved hands deft and sure. The broken latch yielded easily, and she lifted the lid once more. The watch gleamed faintly in the lamplight, its glass face cracked, the chain coiled like a sleeping snake beside it. The scrap of silk lay folded beneath, a deep crimson with a faint perfume clinging to it. "Not her color," Miss Marple said quietly. "Mrs. Fane favors sable and pearl. Red is the color of drama, and she prefers irony." Tom looked puzzled. "Then who's—" "Mr. Braithwaite's wife," Miss Marple said softly. "He had a wife once, long before he came here. Died in a fire at his factory, at least that was the story. But this scarf, it bears her initials, and turpentine, of course, is an old friend of fire." Tom's eyes widened. "Who you think Mrs. Fane knew about that?" "I think she knew everything," Miss Marple replied, closing the trunk gently. "And I think she wanted the inspector to find this trunk tomorrow, after she was safely gone, to remind him that she had knowledge worth respecting. You see, she tied no rope herself, but she pulled every string. Poor Mr. Braithwaite may have struck the blow, but she chose the tune to which the bell rang. A gust of wind slipped through the doorway, stirring the shadows." Tom shivered. "Then she's free?" "For now," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but steady. "But freedom bought with secrets is never lasting. People like Mrs. Fane live by cleverness, and cleverness eventually tires. She will make another move in another village, and someone else will notice what she forgets to hide. That is always the way." They left the church in silence. The stars were brighter now, sharp against the black. As they reached the gate, Miss Marple looked back once, listening. The night was still, but in the hush she fancied she heard far off a single bell tolling once more. It sounded less like morning this time, and more like warning. Morning returned to St. Mary Mead with a deceptive calm, a pale sunlight glancing off the rooftops, as if the world itself wished to deny the shadow that lingered over it. The church bell remained silent. Inspector Slack had ordered it so, and the villagers moved about with the cautious politeness of people who feel both curious and faintly guilty. They spoke softly of Mr. Braithwaite's confession and of Mrs. Fane's swift departure, each adding their own garnish of speculation. Yet beneath the talk ran a thread of unease, the sense that something still waited to be uncovered. Miss Marple, who never mistook stillness for peace, felt it too. She sat by her fire, knitting needles flashing steadily, when the door opened without warning. It was the vicar, his face flushed from the cold and from the kind of moral disquiet that always made him stammer. "My dear Miss Marple, forgive me such dreadful news. There's been another disturbance at the station. The porter, old Jenkins, has been found unconscious beside the luggage room. Nothing taken, apparently, except a handful of tickets and Mrs. Fane's second trunk. The one she left behind yesterday." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Ah," she said softly, "so she has not quite finished with us after all." The vicar blinked, astonished by her composure. "But surely she's gone. Inspector Slack said she left on the 8 o'clock train." "She left, yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But that doesn't mean she went very far. One doesn't orchestrate such neat mischief only to flee before enjoying the results." She rose, folding her knitting neatly beside the letter still lying on the table. "I think, dear vicar, it might be wise for you to fetch the inspector at once. Tell him to meet me at the station, and please don't alarm the village. They'll invent far worse than the truth soon enough." The station lay a short walk beyond the green, its little platform dusted with frost, and its single clock ticking solemnly. Miss Marple arrived to find the porter revived but shaken, sitting on a stool with a blanket about his shoulders. He looked up as she approached, grateful and bewildered. "It were her trunk, miss," he said hoarsely. "That fine lady's what went off yesterday. A man came, said he was sent to collect it for her. Smart coat, soft hands, spoke proper. I didn't think nothing of it till he hit me from behind. When I woke, the trunk was gone. Did you notice anything else?" Miss Marple asked, her tone kind but steady. "Perhaps a smell." "A sound." He frowned, rubbing his temple. "Smelt of oil, maybe. And I remember hearing, funny thing, a bell. Just one chime, far off. Thought I was dreaming." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, Jenkins, you were not dreaming." Moments later, Inspector Slack arrived, coat flapping, expression thunderous. "What the devil's going on now?" "Can't turn my back for a day without another mystery cropping up." "Not another mystery, Inspector," Miss Marple said calmly. "Merely the continuation of the same one." He scowled. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning Mrs. Fane did not intend to vanish entirely," she said. "That second trunk was bait. The one Tom Reeves found contained Ned Pollock's watch, planted for us to find. But the other, that one contained what she truly meant to keep. Letters, perhaps, or papers, connecting her to Mr. Braithwaite's business in London. She would have wanted those back, naturally. So she or someone she engaged came in the night to retrieve them." Slack stared at her. "And you think she's still here?" "Oh, quite," Miss Marple replied. "A woman like Mrs. Fane does not vanish until she has ensured that the story ends her way. If you'll permit me, Inspector, I believe she'll try the church once more before she goes. The bell, after all, has become her accomplice of sorts." Muttered something about old women and fairy tales, but followed her nevertheless. They reached the churchyard just as the sky began to darken, with the bruised tint of late afternoon. The snow had crusted again, crunching softly underfoot. The tower door stood ajar, a thread of candlelight leaking through. Slack swore under his breath and motioned her back, but Miss Marple walked forward unhurried. Inside, the air was chill, smelling of wax and dust. At the base of the tower, Mrs. Fane stood beside the bell rope, dressed not for flight but for confrontation. Dark wool coat, gloves immaculate, and her sable collar fastened neatly at the throat. On the table beside her lay an open case, papers half stuffed within. "So," she said coolly, "the village oracle arrives. I wondered how long it would take you." Miss Marple regarded her with quiet pity. "You should have gone, my dear." But pride is an unwise travelling companion. Mrs. Fane's smile was brittle. "Pride? Hardly. I simply dislike being misrepresented. That man, Braithwaite, was a bore and a thief. I gave him the chance to share the profits of his own fraud, but he lacked gratitude. When he tried to cast me off, I reminded him that accidents happen to dishonest men. I did not imagine he would be quite so clumsy about it." Inspector Slack stepped from the shadows. "You'll have plenty of time to explain that at headquarters, madam." For a moment she looked startled, then laughed lightly. "Oh, Inspector, you mistake me. I've no intention of being anyone's prisoner. My train is due in 20 minutes. Miss Marple took a small step forward. But you've already missed it. The trunk, the porter, the papers. You've left too much behind this time. You see, cleverness, like twine, frays when pulled too hard." Mrs. Fane's eyes flickered just once, and in that instant Slack moved. There was a brief struggle, a cry of protest, and then the sound of something small falling to the stone floor, a pocket flask of clear liquid. Its scent sharp and unmistakable. Turpentine. She had planned to burn the papers, to erase her part entirely. When it was over, Mrs. Fane stood motionless, her composure gone, the brittle mask cracked. Slack took her arm firmly, his voice rough but almost respectful. "You might have got away with it, you know, if not for her." Mrs. Fane's gaze slid toward Miss Marple. "Yes," she said softly, almost with admiration. "It's always the quiet ones." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I've found quietness most useful. People do such a lot of talking, you know." As they led her out into the cold, the wind stirred through the bell tower. The great bell gave a low accidental groan, deep and sorrowful, as though it too were weary of deceit. Miss Marple stood for a moment beneath it, hands folded, listening until the echo faded into silence. Then she turned toward home, the faintest smile touching her lips, for she knew the story had at last come full circle. Every lie, every knot, every peal of the bell tied neatly into its proper place. It was 2 days after Christmas when the village began to breathe again. The snow, once crisp and pure, had softened into slush that gleamed in the weak sunlight. Life crept back into its ordinary rhythms, the butcher's boy calling down the lane, the clatter of milk pails, and the distant laughter of children testing the slipperiness of the thawing road. To anyone passing through, St. Mary Mead looked as it always did, innocent, unhurried, a place where nothing dreadful could ever happen. But beneath that familiar calm lay a hush of recent memory, the kind that clings quietly long after the last bell has been silenced. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the flames reflecting in her spectacles as she added the final row to a neat square of blue wool. It had been a troublesome pattern, too many slips at first, but it had come right in the end, as such things usually do when one pays attention. She folded the piece carefully and placed it in the small basket by her chair just as Inspector Slack was announced at the door. He entered with less bluster than usual, cap in hand, the cold clinging to him like a reluctant companion. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "I thought you might want the latest before it reaches the gossip circuit." She smiled. "I hardly need it, Inspector. Gossip travels faster than truth. Still, I should be very glad to hear the official version." He sat down awkwardly, as if politeness were a coat that didn't quite fit. "Well, Mrs. Fane's in custody. We've recovered her papers from the church tower and some correspondence linking her to a fraudulent investment scheme Braithwaite ran years ago. Seems she used that knowledge to blackmail him, threatened to expose the whole business unless he gave her a share. He tried to wriggle free, they quarreled, and, well, you know the rest." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "Poor Ned happened upon their quarrel, I think. He must have realized something was amiss and tried to intervene. Mr. Braithwaite's temper did the rest. But Mrs. Fane, I imagine, was clever enough to turn his panic into opportunity." Slack nodded. "That's about it. She told him she'd help him make it look like an accident, then used it to keep him in her debt. She'd been planning to leave with whatever she could get from him, but the boy's death stirred more talk than she expected. When you started asking questions, she panicked. Tried to tidy up the loose ends. Her kind always does. Loose ends are very troublesome," Miss Marple said, her needles resting idle in her lap. "They tend to fray when pulled, and then one's careful work begins to unravel. But tell me, Inspector, what will become of her?" Slack gave a short, almost reluctant sigh. "Hard to say. She'll face charges for accessory to murder and fraud. That much certain, though I doubt she'll lose her composure. Some people don't know how." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, but she will lose something far more costly. Cleverness, Inspector, is a fine servant but a cruel master. It makes one believe that truth is merely another puzzle to be solved. Yet truth, like the human heart, resists being arranged. Slack looked faintly embarrassed, as he always did when the conversation turned moral. "You've a way of putting things," he said awkwardly. "Anyway, I'll admit you saw through her long before I did. If I'd relied on evidence alone, she'd be sipping tea in London by now." "I rely on evidence too," Miss Marple said with a small smile. "Only my evidence tends to talk rather than sit on paper. People reveal themselves, Inspector, always. You merely have to watch long enough. Mr. Braithwaite's pride, Mrs. Fane's poise, poor Ned's loyalty, they each played their part. The rest was only timing and the sound of a bell that refused to lie." Slack rose, shifting uncomfortably but not unkindly. "Well, the village can rest easy now. No more mysteries for a while, I hope." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. "Oh, my dear Inspector, rest is a very temporary state. Human nature is remarkably energetic in its ability to create difficulties." He gave a half smile, tugged at his cap and left with a polite nod. When the door closed, the house fell back into its comfortable quiet. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, the aroma of bergamot rising in the air, and sat gazing into the fire. Flames shifted and leapt, the coals glowing with the same deep, steady color as the brass button she had kept, a small token of the night when deceit came ringing through the peace of St. Mary Mead. Outside, the church bell gave a single low peal, restored now to its rightful order. Its tone was deep and sure again, no longer frantic. Miss Marple listened, her expression serene but thoughtful. The sound rolled across the fields, past the cottages and the frozen hedgerows, a solemn reminder that even the smallest village could harbor all the complexities of the human heart: jealousy, pride, deceit, and sometimes redemption. She rose to draw the curtains, the faint smile still upon her lips. "So much fuss over one bell," she murmured, almost to herself. "And yet, it told us everything. It's curious, isn't it, how truth insists on being heard even when people try to muffle it." The kettle gave a small companionable hiss, and Miss Marple went to refill her cup. Snow began to fall again outside, light and unhurried, dusting the village in a clean new white. The world for now looked peaceful, but she knew better than to be deceived by such appearances. For Miss Marple, peace was simply the interval between mysteries, a pause before the next quiet stirring of human folly began. And as the bell's last echo faded into the dusk, she returned to her knitting, her needles clicking softly, steady as a heartbeat beneath the whispering fall of snow. The new year crept into St. Mary Mead quietly, as if reluctant to disturb what had at last settled into calm. The snow had gone, leaving the lanes damp and glistening, and the air carried the faint, hopeful scent of thawing earth. At the Blue Boar, talk of the Christmas tragedy was fading into something almost like legend, softened, embroidered, and retold with a shiver and a sigh. Mr. Braithwaite's name was spoken less now, Mrs. Fane's not at all. The village, Miss Marple reflected, was like a wound that had scabbed neatly over. Tender still, but healing all the same. She sat by her sitting-room fire, the blue wool blanket now finished and folded upon her lap. On the table beside her stood a small vase of winter roses, brought by Tom Reeves that morning, a quiet, thoughtful gesture from a young man who had learned, perhaps too early, that innocence does not always protect one from cruelty. He had found work with the vicar on the Restoration Committee, and though he still walked with his hands deep in his pockets, there was a steadiness about him that hadn't been there before. When Inspector Slack called that afternoon, he found Miss Marple pouring tea with her usual air of mild distraction. "You'll be pleased to hear," he began, warming his hands at the fire, "that Mrs. Fane has decided to speak at last. Seems your instincts were right about her having a hand in the business from the very beginning. She's told the lot, how she and Braithwaite had planned to exploit his investors, how Ned Pollock discovered a letter in the tower room and threatened to tell the vicar. She used that to corner Braithwaite. then let him believe she'd save him. Quite the performance, she says, almost proud of it. Miss Marple's eyes remained on the teapot. Pride has a curious way of surviving exposure, Inspector. It is the last garment the soul removes. Slack grimaced. She'll hang, of course, though the papers are already calling it the Bell Tower tragedy. Romantic rubbish. People like stories, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. They prefer their evil wrapped in ribbon. It's tidier that way. He gave a grunt of reluctant agreement, then hesitated. There's one thing I still can't fathom. How in heaven's name did you guess it was her? She played it so cool, even I nearly believed her innocent. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It wasn't a matter of guessing. It was a matter of listening. You see, Mrs. Fane admired herself too much to keep truly still. She was the only one who called the bell's tone ghastly, not tragic or dreadful as others did. It was such a revealing choice of word, an aesthetic reaction, not an emotional one. It told me she had no grief, only irritation at the untidiness of death. And then, of course, there was the glove. The glove? Beatimer. Yes, Miss Marple said. She wore fine kid gloves, too delicate for the vestry's old latch. The smudge on her wrist was not polish or soot, as one might think, but oil from the bell's pulley. She had handled it recently, far too recently for an innocent observer. And later, when I mentioned it, she looked down to check which wrist exactly. It is a small thing, but small things, Inspector, are the hinges of truth. Slack stared at her for a moment, half amused, half admiring. Hinges of truth, yes, that's about right for you. You notice things nobody else would dream mattered. Human nature, Inspector, she said. It never alters. Only the circumstances do. He rose, tugging at his gloves. Well, the case is closed and the village can sleep easy again. For a time, anyway. Miss Marple smiled up at him. For a time, she echoed. But peace, like innocence, is a fragile visitor. After he had gone, she sat for a long while, the clock ticking softly and the twilight thickening around her. The bell outside the church rang 6 times, its tone deep and even now restored to its true voice. No more of that broken, uneven cry that had haunted the village on Christmas Eve. The sound rolled through the air, full of quiet authority, as though the bell itself was satisfied that justice at last had been done. Miss Marple rose and went to the window. Across the green, the vicar's lantern glowed faintly, and a thin column of smoke rose from the chimneys. Life, she thought, always resumes its pattern no matter what disturbs it. And yet every pattern, if one looks closely enough, reveals the faint trace of where it once unraveled. She watched the snow begin again, slow fine flakes drifting down to soften the world's edges. In her hand she still held the brass button, the small token she had kept from that night. She turned it once between her fingers, before setting it down beside her knitting. A bell, a rope, a bit of twine, she murmured, and human vanity to tie them together. Such little things, really. The fire crackled softly, the flame curling like a whisper. Outside, the bell gave one last gentle chime, more lullaby than lament. Miss Marple listened until the sound faded, her expression serene. "Good night, St. Mary Mead," she said, as if the village could hear her. "Sleep quietly for now." And as the snow deepened, the quiet of the room grew absolute, holding within it that peculiar peace which follows understanding, the peace that only comes when the last thread of mystery has been neatly, mercifully tied.